Welcome to Swing State, where we explore the art and science of leadership, resilience, and purpose in motion. I'm your host, Mina, and today's episode is a deeply personal one. I first met today's guest in Kuala Lumpur at an elite Schlumberger training school, a program you could only attend if your country had nominated you. Just a handful of us were selected each year from different parts of the world. He was our trainer, but more than that, he became a mentor whose teachings I've carried into every industry I've entered since. He has this incredible ability to get into the weeds with people who have zero sales experience and in just 30 days shape them into professionals with world-class capability. His secret? Understanding people, their mindset, their behaviors and decision-making styles. What he taught us wasn't just about closing deals. It was about how to open doorways to trust. His journey spans decades across the energy sector, from his early years in oil and gas operations to leading national policy initiatives as the chairman of Sri Lanka's Petroleum Development Authority. Today, we'll talk about that arc, from high-pressure field ops to high-stakes public service, and the values that kept him grounded through it all. Sal, welcome to Swing State. It's an honor to have you here.
Mina, thank you very much. The honor is mine. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Let's go back to the beginning. You studied engineering physics, a rigorous technical path. What first drew you into this space?
Physics to me was easier than chemistry. And apart from being anecdotal, it's also a more simpler science to get involved with, because it simplifies things down to four basic forces that explain everything we see, sense, touch, feel, and hear. So from that point of view, it was all about the world around me, and physics was always something interesting. I had a little mathematical skill, and that helped. So it just saw me in the world of physics.
And how then from engineering physics into oil and gas?
That was quite a fortuitous accidental step. Everybody in my university in the UK at the time was applying for oil and gas jobs because they were then known to be better paid. And as a result, I followed that wave and somehow or the other went through a series of interviews and found myself in Schlumberger, just like you did. At the beginning of a career that I didn't see the end of. I didn't even know what it involved in the early days. So it wasn't a specific direction. It was just bringing my skills from physics to bear in the real world to deal with practical situations.
And what was some of the more formative experience in those early years working in the oil and gas industry?
The diversity, Mina, primarily the fact that you'd be in different countries from time to time, different environments, working with different cultures and different, completely different challenges. And that diversity came to be a part of my life. I carry with me today. I still have a body clock that comes on and tells me every 2 or 3 years, what's my next assignment? Where do I go? Where would I like to go? So it was the fact that you are a young person given fairly intensive training, and then you are released to represent the company that you work for on your own with a small crew in a remote location for days and sometimes weeks. So that was an element of responsibility that made it attractive. I soon understood why they paid us more than other people, because they gave us a lot more responsibility and held us a lot more accountable and made us work a lot harder. But ultimately, my experiences boiled down to identifying what was then known. It's an elusive concept known as the Schlumberger spirit. You may have heard it yourself. The term Schlumberger spirit was used loosely. It was never defined. And it was always taken to mean the ability to deliver under pressure, the ability to not give up, the ability to maintain a good rapport with your customer at the well site and your crew on whose capabilities you yourself depended, and do a tough job in difficult conditions. So that term has now become more corporatized as most companies have evolved, and now I believe it is they are known as the Schlumberger values, which are people, technology, and performance. But in the old days, there was this undefined thing called Schlumberger spirit, and for me, that was something that I look for in people even today, although I don't call it by the same name.
How were some of the lessons that you learned and gathered at Schlumberger helpful as you navigated your change to more the government sector?
My primary memories and enduring impressions of my first few years in Schlumberger was what it was like to be a good boss. Now, you see bosses come and go quite often, sometimes every year, every 2 years. And I noticed there was a huge disparity of, shall we say, character. Despite the fact that they all were qualified and went through the mill of being selected and trained, some of them were better than others. And I found very soon that that rule doesn't change what sector you're in, whether you're in the private sector, the public sector, or wherever. You have to be a good boss. Your employees or your team's problems, all of them must become yours, and they must know that. So people who have the confidence or the comfort to bring you a problem don't want to be deflected to other places and other people for the solution of that problem. Many of my old bosses used to get up, take me by the hand and said, "Come with me, sir." And they would walk to human resources or payroll or wherever this problem existed, and they would sort it out for me. That's a very little step, but it actually involves a lot more work than referring me to somebody else and sending a supporting email. So from that point of view, even today, everything that is an issue to people that I work with becomes an issue for me personally, and I do my best to solve it there. So this is a guiding principle I think people tend to forget in these days of systems and processes, but that human touch was my biggest lesson from my different bosses back in the day.
As I went through my MBA, I learned a lot of prioritized terminology around good leadership character and things like leadership judgment. And my experience up until then was in a very diverse environment. I got a chance to view leadership from what it looked like, probably as a representation of different cultures. One thing that stood out to me was that a good leader is resilient. And you echoed that sentiment, Sal, because being a good leader in the face of adversity means that you can take the heat and take the pressure, be resilient, and still bounce back for your team when they need you. What was the biggest mindset change required, if any, to operate effectively in the public service? Was there any shift that you needed to make in how you operated?
Maybe I'm going to step back from that to address a point that you brought up earlier, and that is leadership styles. I find that I am what modern people would call a servant leader. In other words, the person that wishes to stay in the background, the person that empowers people to go to the sand face and perform actions, operations, discussions, meetings, and so on and so forth, guides them, supports them, and also resources them. But I learned there's a very specific story that I would like to share, which gave me the deeper meaning behind what it is to be a servant leader. And that is the fact that while you empower your team or your subordinates to act on your behalf, you actually still need to retain the responsibility of their actions. This is often forgotten in the modern world, where delegation is also delegating accountability. The reality of it is delegation is delegating authority, but retaining accountability. Now, here's the little story. There was, when I was in charge of operations in the Gulf of Suez, a young engineer who was very capable, South American guy, Juan Carlos Yepes. He was sent out to perform a particular type of job that you and I are familiar with. It was a perforation job on a platform. And he went out there. For those who are not familiar with the term, it involves handling explosives, setting explosives off below the surface, if done wrong, causing irreparable harm to the facility, to the well. So Juan Carlos went out there, and then he said, "Look, Sal, I'm not comfortable with my depth correlation. I don't think we should fire the gun." And I said, "Thank you, Juan. I'll take that back to GUPCO." So I went across to the Gulf Petroleum Company and had a chat with them, and they said, "No, we understand why you think you're not correct, but here we are. You're authorized to proceed on our instructions." So I took these instructions back to the radio room, spoke to Juan, and I said, "JC, GUPCO says go ahead and fire the gun." So there was a short pause at the other side, and he said, "Sal, I just can't do that because I don't feel good about it." So I said, "JC, I'll make it easy for you. I am authorizing you to fire the gun." And then JC said, "Sal, I'm really sorry, but I can't do it." Then I told him, "I'll make it even easier for you. I am instructing you to fire the gun." Now, because I have this authority from the client, He said, Sal, I'm really sorry, I can't do that either. Upon some reflection, I found myself completely agreeing with him. Now, whether I would have done the same or not is still a matter open for discussion. But I went back to GUPCO and I said to them, we are sorry. Our engineer on board your facility does not think it is the right thing to do. So despite your approval to proceed, we have declined it. And I received a lot of pushback for that. But I learned that when you have a team, you must support them with your entire self. In other words, if somebody doesn't like what they do and then they cannot be convinced that it is in fact the right thing to do, you then need to back them up. So then I realized that part of being a servant leader is to take the pressure on behalf of everybody in the team.
Thank you very much for sharing that story. I think it's a very, very crucial one to go along with the episode because we're stepping into an age where our critical thinking is being overpowered by artificial intelligence and also, a lot of new talent that is floating in kind of the leadership circles these days, new in the sense of being diverse, being in different places, but maybe not having necessarily the technical depth in one particular sector, makes it even more important for the teams to have their set of critical thinking, the right kind of frameworks and resources that they can leverage to always take the right decision in the essence of the community, the planet, and the organization that they're working for, and their own safety. Oil and gas was an industry where all of our decisions were always had to be backed with the confidence that this is not going to cause any harm in any of the above fields or more, and only then could we pursue. But we did. I remember being an engineer in the field, and it would be of tremendous support when my leader would back my instinct or my analytics up rather than pressurizing me to go and do something, because that gives me both the accountability, the responsibility that my decisions need to be, or my suggestions, my insights, and my consultation to my leadership needs to be accurate as well. So not only did you put light on what you learned as a leader, but also deeply valuing what your team member thought in that time reflects that critical thinking remains one of the most important skills in industries like oil and gas or nuclear or even aerospace, things like that.
And the epilogue of the Juan Carlos Yepes story is that he was proven right some weeks later. And then that initial angst and distrust and anger in many ways, because we did cause a lot of delay, turned completely into the opposite, which was a complete trust in him, in me, in our company, because we stood up to what we collectively believed in, and we refused to perform something even under instruction. So there was an epilogue. The epilogue, it finished positively. So there's some hope for people who take that step and do as you just said.
Indeed. Thank you for sharing the lesson learned. How would you sum up resilience as a lesson from this story?
I would say it would be the ability to withstand enormous pressure. And as you well know, oil and gas companies can put a lot of pressure on people who work in the industry because their clock runs in minutes and not hours. So there's a huge amount of accountability even up on their chain, because people need to take responsibility for their actions, and those people who cannot get a job done in the field take it out on the people that won't do this job. So from that standpoint, the ability to withstand pushback to me is one sign of resilience. Now, the other one to that would be often said in diverse environments ranging from flying aircraft to performing special operations in the military is always depend on your equipment. So rather than letting too much doubt creep in through human frailties, so you've got to be resilient in your positioning, and then also resilient in depending on your training, your background, your experience, and project that confidence to those around you.
And then how do you take that capability and address the challenges in public service?
That's a great question. Now, the primary difference between, if we're talking about public service in my country, Sri Lanka, it's different from public service in other countries, perhaps. Now, take Singapore, for example. Singapore public servants are selected from the best of the best graduates from their universities. They're paid the highest salaries, and they're given completely almost borderless, but well-defined responsibilities. A bit like how we were recruited into Schlumberger. But in my country, the civil service, public service, doesn't come from the top end. It actually comes from the middle and lower end of graduates because the countries like us just don't pay enough. They recruit too many, and they give them the security of government jobs and government pensions and give them a sense of their job is not really dependent on how you did or how well you did in your last job as ours was. There's a job security that is fairly unassailable, and therefore performance drops because people become complacent. So now the biggest difference between the private sector and the public sector that I had to deal with was the fact that in the private sector, you could choose the army you want to go to war with. In the public sector, you went to war with the army you had. So this, of course, meant that I had to work overtime in using teams that I couldn't really change. I couldn't fire. I could hardly hire. I couldn't transfer. I just needed to work with them, identify, and then leverage their capabilities, and then bring into bear all my background and skills and training to be able to bring them up to a certain level, the level that satisfied me in terms of their service delivery.
I guess I've never had any flavor of any public service organization or any experience on even the periphery of it to know this, but it sounds like a lot of pressure to be dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And so I would love to learn how you kept yourself grounded. I know you're an optimistic person, but how did you manage that stress?
That also is a very good question, and it has many facets to it. I'll break them down as quickly and simply as I can. But I would say my primary grounding is the fact that I took my time, Mina, to form a decision or to make a decision, form an opinion on anything. So when I come into a new place, which I did, several institutions in the government, I didn't really do anything much for 6 months because that's the period you give yourself. It's like making a good decision. Then the key thing about making good decisions is to just know by when you need to make it. The moment you identify by when you need to make a decision, then you defer it until that point and spend the intervening period gathering as much information as possible to improve the quality of the decision. So from my point of view, you don't act in haste. You act in a measured and studied manner. And once you act, you hold the line. So in other words, if you're taking steps, making decisions, performing actions that are different, perhaps novel, innovative, take your time in doing so. Make sure that you analyze everything that's involved in that decision and then hold that line. So resolve is important to give you that grounding, the confidence in your own decision. And that only comes from using all the tools we have in our arsenal to make good decisions. And then you don't display any uncertainty or any biddability or any shall we say, any willingness to change based on superficial.
You've been at the heart of Sri Lanka's energy future, especially pushing for responsible petroleum development and sustainability. How do you balance pragmatism with the need for long-term sustainability?
That's a tough question to ask a petroleum engineer because I, like you, to a certain extent of your career, grew up, and in particular in mine, I was an explorationist. I was a wireline logging engineer that collected the data based on which customers found and produced oil and gas. And the word sustainability then meant something else. Now, sustainability means essentially planet-friendly, green, and commercially sustainable. In the old days, it meant profitability. So you've got to change your mindset. Well, I've had to change my mindset to the point that whatever a nation or a country has in terms of hydrocarbon resources, that producing it now is going to add to the carbon footprint of the planet. So from that point of view, there's a moderation that has crept in over the years into decisions we take in government about stuff like that. We have signed global accords committing to decarbonization and so on and so forth. There is, however, the north-south injustice, in climate terms, where although I believe that whatever oil and gas still exists below the ground should remain now in the ground because technology has started to provide us with ample alternatives. for energy. When it becomes, from a national standpoint, lower hanging fruit, then I believe that nations like Sri Lanka and others have the right to develop hydrocarbon resources on a scale that is necessary but not unlimited to defray economic stress. So from that standpoint, while the rest of the world is decarbonizing, if, for example, we can get out of an economic hole over the next 5 years by producing oil and gas in Sri Lanka, I believe that is a justifiable step out of the conventions, because despite signing conventions and despite the larger, more developed nations, such as Canada, for example, who thrived in 70s and 80s and 90s, we owe ourselves that. We are aware of the north-south injustice in terms of climate, but at the same time, we reserve the right to take certain steps to develop resources that make an economic difference to the people, certainly over the short term. So from that standpoint, we've got to be pragmatic from a world view, but you've got to be even more pragmatic from a local, domestic, economic point of view.
I can follow along and appreciate that approach. I think India is also exactly at that spot where we could at some point completely look at decarbonization, but in the short run, we probably got to run with a mix of different strategies, not forgetting that our oil and gas reserves and mining reserves are still existing as resources. Exploration of those should not be uncapped, and there should continue to remain accountable measures put in place so that despite the technology and the advances, that we don't lose sight of the ultimate value that we're seeking to bring, and that the return on investment always makes sense for everybody involved. I'm curious about what, now myself having left the industry about 8 or 9 years ago, I'm curious about what emerging trends you're most excited about in shaping a more responsible energy sector, let's say in Sri Lanka or South Asia for that matter.
Mina, I think electrification, although this was first noted at the beginning of the century and then squashed by the oil majors, electrification of industry and transport is, to me, the future, because solar radiation is free, wind is free from the resource cost standpoint. They come with certain challenges, which now technology is helping us address, both hardware and software-wise. So from that standpoint, what I'm excited about is to explore more cost-effective options for energy storage, for example. How do you make renewable energy more dispatchable, or dispatchable, in fact? Energy conversion for the same objective. And then when you have all this latency and intermittency connected with fluctuating wind speeds and passing clouds and so on and so forth, that does genuinely affect stability of grid. How do you bring in grid enhancement or grid auxiliary technologies such as frequency control, inertia, and so on and so forth, to make our current systems of delivery of power able to integrate much, much more renewable energy and make all of it plannable and dispatchable? That technology is something that I find quite interesting. Now, that's on one side of the coin. On the other side of the coin, there is the idea that we need to actually pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And in that case, there are other technologies emerging there. They still don't have cost effectiveness in terms of people are not willing to pay the premium for decarbonization in most parts of the world. The carbon market is voluntary in most parts of the world. So from that point of view, carbon capture, sequestration, and utilization, or CCSU, if you look at it from an oil and gas company's point of view, if your reserves are suffering constraints on being burned and therefore monetized, then you want to invest in another branch of technology which pulls the carbon out of the atmosphere that you're wanting to put back in. So there's a chain like this that has spawned a whole bunch of new efficiencies in energy management that is quite exciting.
I think clean energy is getting tied into our lives in more than one ways, and there's technology that we definitely need to use to our advantage. But I would think that the leadership philosophies that you've imbibed, folks of my generation, or maybe somewhere in between, are always going to come handy, and they're always going to be the guiding light for whatever shape or form the industry might take from one to another, or what technology might matter over another. But I think those guiding principles will continue. And so in that light, I would love to understand Sal, what legacy has meant to you over the years and how you've kept your focus in making sure that you remain true to your value system while delivering results, while also focusing on what you're building for yourself in the long run.
Thank you, Mina. Wherever I've been and whatever I've done, I have understood within a short period of time whether I was gaining traction in that role or not. Now, it's fundamental that flailing around and not achieving anything isn't going to help anyone's cause, let alone, least of all, one's own. So I think it's important to identify quickly whether one is able to and is able to make a difference, which means achieving results, and it means convincing people of many, many things. From that standpoint, all of what we discussed back in the day in terms of sales and marketing, the context of it is that everything we do is a sale. You've got to focus on achieving the results you set for yourself. And if you can do that, now you asked about legacy, so I'm getting there. If you can do that without raising your voice, hurting too many feelings, and not necessarily taking the credit even, I'd love to see people who achieve results quietly, without too much fanfare, who are able to understand who makes the decisions, who are able to understand how to convince others of the facts that are required to move forward, get to either an FID or a project approval, or even on the implementation of a new manpower and human resource talent management plan. So from that standpoint, I like to see more of that happening, because that was my model. My model was leading from the back and not from the front. My model was achieving results, not necessarily taking the credit for it. My model was empowering people, but holding responsibility for their action. And I hardly ever screamed at anybody, and I hardly ever essentially hurt anybody's feelings. I mean, I may have, but not intentionally. So that combination for me is the legacy I believe I would be satisfied seeing in others that follow.
If there was one piece of advice that you could give to young professionals today, or those even navigating uncertain times in their careers or in some sort of a flux, what would it be?
I think the one word is authenticity. People who understand people recognize authenticity. And authenticity, it just simply means being who you are and not who you think you are. That's a tough bridge to cross, because all of us have to wear masks. All of us have to overperform or be seen overperforming in order to win favor from our bosses. But one should, in my humble opinion, young professionals, wherever they are, even if they go from company to company to company every year or 2 years, be authentic in what you say, do, and how you act. Itself requires you to give yourself a little bit of, shall we say, give yourself a few tools. One of them, I would say, is homework. You've got to do your homework. You've got to know about the people that you're going to meet. You've got to know about the problems you're going to discuss. You need to know about the challenges you're going to face. So there's no substitution for hard work. Everybody expects results very quickly. But patience, to me, is a huge virtue. It's a huge strength. And if you can't approach something and succeed today, give it a little time and try it in a different way tomorrow.
Thank you, Sal. And finally, in the spirit of swing state, what keeps your internal compass steady today?
Well, my memories, Mina, my experiences, they are a very strong grounding for me. And while I am open to change in terms of outlook, recognizing contexts may change, my values are essentially based around the biblical principle of, they call it the golden rule, which is always do unto others how you would wish others to do unto you. And I do my best to live that. And when you take that decision and you hold yourself responsible and accountable for your actions, I think you don't need much more than that.
Thank you for your time today, Sal. Thank you for your wisdom, the humility, the clarity, the stories you've shared from the private sector to national energy corridors. You've shown that true leadership isn't about control. It's about care. It's about staying authentic, doing your homework, understanding the people you're working with. And there is no substitution for hard work. There really isn't. Being able to adapt, but with integrity, and staying rooted in your purpose are all levers that you should develop so that you can pull them in time. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If today's conversation resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe, or leave us a review. We're here to learn through stories that move us. Until next time, stay in motion and stay learning.